Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective. So the only way he figures that he's going to get reelected, and as sure as you're sitting there, is to start a war with Iran.
I say they're lousy fighters, but they're great negotiators.
Hello, 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 everyone. This is the Traditionalist, and yes, after almost 4 months, I am finally back with a new video. Of course, you can tell from the name of this video exactly what this is about. Of course, we are going to be talking about the Iran war, which might honestly be the most disastrous war of the entire millennium. And here I will break down exactly why. And I will show why Trump's statement at the start of the video is true, just instead of that describing Iran, it describes the United States. As many of you know, the 2026 Iran war has come to an end, at least officially, although of course unofficially it seems like things are still tense and the situation is constantly changing. By the time this video comes out, there could have been more updates, so I cannot speak for anything happening past June 20th, June 21st, but assuming that the peace has been held, I will talk about the war as if it is finished. Now, of course, this war was a complete and utter failure, and this video will be here to explain exactly why that is. Now, unfortunately, it is really sad that there was no one who could have predicted this. No one could have predicted, one, that we would be going to war with Iran, and two, that it would go so badly. I mean, it's not as if Trump or anything was talking many times about how awful a war with Iran would be and why he was the candidate of peace. Wait, what's that? He did all those things? Oh yeah, and it wasn't even that long ago. Why don't we just rewind the clock to, I don't know, like 2 years ago and see what the big orange man had to say.
I am the candidate of peace. I am peace. People don't believe that.
I wonder why, Donald. I really do wonder why.
I believe in strength, but to start a war in order to get elected, and I believe that's going to happen, would be an outrage.
One of the reasons that I and many other people used to support this fat moron is because he promised that he would not start any new wars. And he himself, as we've just seen, said that the only reason that someone would start a war is because they are incompetent and they need to do something to win an election.
We don't want to get into wars. We're tired of fighting. I'm the only president in the last 84 years that didn't start a war. Under Trump, we will have no more wars. No more wars. No more wars. We will have prosperity and we will have peace.
So it has become very clear what Trump stood for. He stood for peace, and he stood specifically against war in Iran because he correctly recognized that a president who went to war with Iran would cause a disaster and was an incompetent idiot who was starting fights that they could not win. But what happened once Trump actually got elected? Well, he broke his promises. And while it is of course true that presidents and politicians in general often break their promises, the complete 180 on this issue really was quite stunning. But maybe some of us should have seen this coming a lot earlier, because after all, there was a small but significant change that happened quite a bit earlier, which signaled in which direction the United States was heading.
President Donald Trump issued an executive order on Friday renaming the Department of Defense as the Department of War. Some of Trump's Republican supporters in Congress have proposed legislation that would make the name change official. However, without that change of law, Trump is authorizing the Pentagon to use secondary titles. The Department of War was the original name from 1789 until it was changed in 1947, just 2 years after the end of World War II. Trump has expressed a preference for the original name.
It just sounded to me better.
Trump and his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, have long talked about changing the name, and then today, in the Pentagon, signage outside of the Secretary's office was changed from Secretary of Defense to Secretary of War.
Why don't we learn a little bit more about the Secretary for War? After all, as the media told us, he is a strong and patriotic Christian who fights for his values, who wants to defend Christianity against its enemies, and who is a good and upright moral man. Oh wait, what's that? Oh, he got divorced multiple times? He's full of tattoos? He's an alcoholic? And what is this that he's saying about the religion that killed Jesus? Let's give it a listen.
Jennifer and I and others had a chance to go see the western wall of the Temple Mount. And there's no reason why the miracle of the reestablishment of the temple on the Temple Mount is not possible.
So it seems like Mr. Crusader here is only against Islam because it goes against the plans of the Jews to rebuild their third temple. Even though we know explicitly that Jesus prophesied the fall of the temple and that the next time that there will be a temple is when the Antichrist will come back. So great job, Mr. So-called Christian, for openly supporting a project that would help usher in the Antichrist. Now, of course, I know that evangelicals like him are fully aware of that, but support it because then they think Jesus will come back. And I know this is someone who used to be evangelical myself, but it is still quite a ridiculous stance. But now with some of the context on how this entire war was predicted as a disaster and that the people who run it are incompetent and ultimately not loyal to the United States, why don't we have a little bit of a history lesson to understand how we got here? So I am not really going to delve too deep into the history, partially because I am already quite familiar with it, and honestly, this isn't a history channel. I already have my own history channel, which you should check out and subscribe to, but ultimately there are so many other people who have gone over the history, so I'll only give in the most relevant details. As many of you know, Iran used to be a monarchy, and pretty much all of their petroleum, pretty much their oil, right, was controlled by the British and the Americans. And then the Iranians wanted to nationalize their own oil. The British and Americans were like, no, no, no. And so they engineered a coup to overthrow the democratically elected prime minister and replace him with their puppet Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who then ruled over the country with the help of his secret police up until 1979, after which the Islamic Revolution happened and the basically British, American, Israeli puppet was overthrown and it was replaced with a Islamic theocratic republic. Like many other people who have no nuance and will basically claim that one side is good and the other side is bad, I'm going to try to just give some perspective that is of course biased because of course this is my channel, but where I do try to acknowledge the legitimate arguments of both sides. The reality is that Iran under the Shah was genuinely more prosperous, and the people tended to be better off as long as they did not cross the state and their secret police. On the other hand, the Islamic Revolution represented a genuine nationalist resistance against foreign American and Israeli control over their governments. And so in that sense, it is completely understandable why the Iranians got tired of their monarchical regime. But as with most revolutions, the regime that replaced it was probably a lot worse, being pretty despotic, tyrannical, and of course being an Islamic theocracy where minorities of all kinds, but especially religious minorities, have been viciously persecuted. And so all this is to say that this video is not going to be glazing Iran's regime or talking about how great they are just because they oppose the United States and Israel. But remember, within the context of this war, we are talking about ultimately who is responsible for this war, not whether Iran is a good country. So we need to turn the clock now to 2003, when Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei issued a fatwa, or Islamic, basically religious condemnation against nuclear weapons. And so Iran insisted that it was only using enrichment to create nuclear energy for civilian purposes. Despite this, though, the United States was still worried about Iran's nuclear intentions. So in 2015, President Barack Obama negotiated the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. This was an agreement in which Iran promised to use its nuclear program strictly for civilian purposes and not for the creation of a nuclear weapon. So everything was good, right? They had an agreement. Iran was not going to make a nuclear bomb that could threaten the United States or any of its allies, including Israel. But guess who broke the deal? Was it Iran? No, it was the United States, which broke its deal under heavy Israeli pressure. And who was the president at that time? Oh yeah, it was Donald Trump. So in 2018, Donald Trump broke the deal, reimposed sanctions, and applied a maximum pressure strategy against Iran. So, already the United States was being the aggressor here, but it got worse. Because then, as we all remember, last summer in 2025, the United States and Israel attacked Iran completely unprovoked in what has now become known as the 12 Days War. And what did they do after the war? Well, even though the United States claimed total victory and said that it had destroyed all of Iran's nuclear capabilities, they still got the United Nations to reimpose sanctions on Iran, which caused the currency to weaken and resulted in the increase of the price of food. In fact, these sanctions were so brutal that by the end of 2025, the currency had completely collapsed. Now, what were the effects of this? Well, Iranians were rightfully angry at their government. Although, of course, the United States played a major role in this, we need to not sugarcoat things. Iran, as I said, is a repressive Islamic theocracy that brutally suppresses its own citizens, as we saw with the protests over the hijab recently, its treatment, or I should say its mistreatment of Christians, and just of ordinary civilians in general who do not have really any rights at all. What this resulted then in was the outbreak of protests in early 2026, demanding changes to the government, with some people calling for a regime change. It makes sense. After all, the Iranians literally had nothing to lose. Their currency was completely worthless, and they were being ruled by these frankly awful rulers in Tehran. So, what happened though while these Iranian protests were going on? Ones that for the first time seriously seemed like they could topple the government. Well, the United States and Iran, or sorry, I should say the United States and Israel, watched on and they did nothing. They built up their military posture. In fact, the United States actually gathered its largest force in the region since the Iraq War. But again, they did nothing. And so what happened? Well, Iran unfortunately killed over 30,000 protesters, and that might be a lower estimate. And by the end of February, it looked like the momentum was dead, and the Iranians would be stuck under their regime's rule for a lot longer. But then everything changed, because on February 24th, Trump claimed, with zero evidence by the way, that Iran had restarted its nuclear program. The same one that he had supposedly destroyed in the summer.
Now I hear that Iran is trying to build up again, and if they are, we're going to have to knock them down. We'll knock them down. We'll knock the hell out of them, but hopefully that's not happening. I heard Iran wants to make a deal. If they want to make a deal, that's much smarter. You know, they could have made a deal the last time before we went through, a big attack on them, and they decided not to make the deal. They wish they made that deal. So I think, again, they should make a deal. They want to make a deal, but sometimes that doesn't happen.
Now, did it matter that U.S. intelligence reported that Iran posed no threat to the U.S. and would not even be able to do so for the next decade? No. I mean, who listened to intelligence agencies, after all? But which country in the Middle East actually does have weapons that could threaten the U.S.? Oh, wait. Isn't it the so-called greatest ally, which has rejected multiple international calls to follow the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or to participate in negotiations to make the Middle East a nuclear-free zone? Well, okay, look, it's obvious that the US is not very well known for holding Israel to the same standards as everyone else. And it used the false pretext of an Iranian nuclear threat to amass forces in the Middle East. But it is interesting because, as I said earlier, this was the largest deployment since the Iraq War, which was also waged on the same false claims that the country possessed weapons of mass destruction. So what happened? Well, Israel and the United States demanded to have negotiations with Iran to talk about their non-existent nuclear weapons program. And then, right in the middle of negotiations, and without any warning, Israel caused the United States to attack Iran, on the 28th of February, starting the 2026 Iran war. Wait a second, didn't you just say that Israel caused the United States to attack Iran? That's not actually fair because the United States was fully responsible for doing so. Oh wait, what's this? Marco Rubio himself admitted that Israel caused the war and that they basically had their hand forced? Oh yeah, why don't we take a look at that?
If we stood and waited for that attack to come first before we hit them, we would suffer much higher casualties. And so the president made the very wise decision. We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act.
Well, I do have to give Rubio credit for at least one thing, which is his total honesty, which is that the entire war was just caused by Israel because Israel was going to attack Iran anyway, regardless of the outcomes of the negotiations, and so essentially the US was forced to act before Iran attacked them first. Now, does this mean the US isn't to blame? Well, of course, they are still to blame because they could have told Israel to not attack or threatened to do something if they caused this war without their permission. But you might ask, why didn't the United States do this? After all, what leverage does Israel have over the government? Well, I don't think you need to be told this in 2026, but just in case you still don't understand, Israel completely controls and occupies the United States government, and this can be seen in a bunch of factors. And we don't even have to delve into any conspiracies here. This is all out in the open. So why don't we just start with this tweet from AIPAC. AIPAC, if you don't know, is the American Israeli Political Action Conference or Committee or something like that. And they themselves have said that 97% of AIPAC-backed candidates have won their election and that they have helped defeat 12 candidates who worked to undermine the US-Israel relationship. So, in other words, 97% of the candidates who are paid for by a foreign lobbying organization have won their election, meaning that if you support this foreign country, you are basically guaranteed to get into the government. How's that possible? Well, it's quite simple. It's because these same people own the media and they also own the banks, which means that when a candidate who runs against them runs, well, as we saw with the recent case of Thomas Massie, they get constant negative news coverage and they don't get nearly as much money, which means that they can just basically outbribe everyone else so that their candidates can win. And after all, we also know that AIPAC is the biggest and most effective lobbying organization. Now, some people will say, oh, well, other countries also have lobbying organizations. But again, why don't we listen to the words of the former president and, by the way, also assaulter, Bill Clinton, who himself described AIPAC as stunningly effective and better than anyone else lobbying in this town. So, we can also see here that members who were more supportive of Israel received more from pro-Israel donors on average. After all, if you are pro-Israel, you receive on average $125,000, whereas if you are pro-Palestine, you receive only $18,000. And by the way, in case anyone comes at me in the comments, no, I am not saying we should have pro-Palestinian donors because our government, well, I shouldn't say our because I'm not American, but I say ours in Western governments. Our governments should not be receiving foreign money at all. They should be serving the interests of the American people or whichever country they happen to represent. But as we all know, Israel and the US essentially are one country. And I mean, we even saw earlier this year that Congress was quietly moving to integrate the US and Israeli militaries, which essentially just shows that Israel and the US are the same country, with Israel clearly being in charge. But again, sure we could say yes, Israel spends a lot of money to make sure that candidates who support them get into power, right? They pay for advertisements, they pay for lots of volunteers and lots of workers. You know, they might have a strong media campaign, and they might even just bribe these politicians directly. But how can all that ensure that the US would still stand by them when their own interests are hurt? Well, that is where you need blackmail, because blackmail, as we all know, is the oldest and most effective form of leverage. And what possible blackmail could Israel have on Trump? I really wonder what it could be. Oh yeah, remember Epstein? Yeah, I know we all forgot about him the moment that the Iran war started, but just to remind you guys, Israel ran the largest sex trafficking operation and human trafficking operation of all time, in which thousands of children were brutally assaulted, sacrificed, and many other unspeakable things happened to them. Now, I'm not going to go at all into the Epstein files. That was my last video. I made an entire expose of all the crimes in the Epstein files. So if you want to learn more about that, although of course I do caution you because it's a lot of disturbing content, go watch that video. And I expose also, of course, the Israeli element to all of that. But fundamentally, we know that Israel used the Epstein network as a way to blackmail Trump, because the first time they were going to go to war earlier on this year, he refused, and so they released the files. And so now, after that, Trump was forced to start this war so that everyone would focus on the war instead of the horrific crimes that he did. And again, mind you that the president, at the very least, is a direct accomplice in the cover-up of the largest sex trafficking operation in human history, or, if you have any level of common sense, was directly responsible for not only assaulting children, but also potentially in the murder of multiple children too. So with all of this context provided, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that a president who himself said that only an incompetent and idiotic leader would go to war with Iran did exactly that, probably partially due to Israeli bribery and influence the government, and partially due to the blackmail that they themselves had on him. Trump does not seem like the kind of person who really wanted to go to war, but now that he did, let's at least find out what the war was about. Now, as we have already said, there was literally zero evidence for the war being about nuclear weapons, and so we don't even need to take that threat seriously. Now, some people will also say that it was about liberating the people of Iran because, after all, as I mentioned earlier, about 30,000 of the protesters got slaughtered. But I think Trump revealed very quickly what his real intention was the entire time.
Do you want regime change in Iran?
Well, it seems like that would be the best thing that could happen. For 47 years, they've been talking and talking and talking. In the meantime, we've lost a lot of lives while they talk, and legs blown off, arms blown off, faces blown off. It's been going on for a long time, so let's see what happens. In the meantime, we have tremendous power has arrived, and additional power, as you know, another carrier is going out shortly. So we'll see it out. If we could get it settled for once and for all, that would be good.
Who do you want to take over?
What?
Who would you want to take over?
I don't want to talk about that.
A short interview alone reveals quite a lot. It reveals that, as we all suspected, the real reason for the war was regime change, not to liberate the Iranian people, and certainly had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. But what is interesting is the final question where they ask, so who's going to take over? Now, most people believe that Reza Pahlavi, the son of the ousted Shah, was going to take over. And it makes sense. I mean, after all, this guy is the biggest cuck for Israel that you can imagine, and even supported Israel bombing his own people. You don't believe that? Well, why don't we take a little look at what he himself has said.
All right, are you actually saying then that Israel bombing your country, civilians in Iran being killed, is a positive thing?
I'm not saying that the targeting was meant to hurt the Iranian people. The targeting was meant to basically neutralize the regime threat. Clearly, I don't think that it was an intention of the Israeli government to attack Iranian civilians.
Really, Reza? Really? So why was it that the very first act of this so-called war of liberation was the supposedly accidental destruction of a girls' school in Minab, in which dozens and dozens of innocent children were killed? Let's take a look.
The American President Donald Trump says that the United States is investigating into the deadly bombing of a school in Iran. But he's also now reiterating that it was Iran that struck the school. Now, Iran has said that more than 150 young girls were killed in this attack by the Americans on an elementary school in the southern city of Minab. Now, initial probe both by the US agencies and the Western media indicated that it was the United States of America that was responsible for dropping a Tomahawk missile on the school. A video showed a US Tomahawk cruise missile striking the school, but Trump has still tried to shift the blame on Iran, even suggesting that Tehran also apparently has some Tomahawks.
Footage that showed that an American missile strike and a Tomahawk missile likely destroyed that Iranian girls' school. So will the U.S. accept any responsibility?
Well, I
for
haven't
that strike?
seen it, and I will say that the Tomahawk, which is one of the most powerful weapons around, is used by, is sold and used by other countries, you know that. And whether it's Iran, who also has some Tomahawks, I wish they had more, but whether it's Iran or somebody else, the fact that a Tomahawk is very generic. It's sold to other countries.
Now, as we very well know, Trump is not very good at taking responsibility for bad actions. But my goodness, was that a pathetic excuse. But you might think, oh, this is just a mistake. I mean, it's not like Trump would ever harm little girls or anything. Right? Right? Oh, what? Tell me the guy whose name appeared in the Epstein files more than God appears in the Bible would harm little girls? Whoa, that's crazy. Yeah, obviously it's not. I'm being sarcastic here, for those of you who can't tell. In all seriousness, it's ridiculous that this is how the war started, but again, it makes sense. After all, we know that Trump, the American government, and Israel all serve Baal. Who is Baal? Well, Baal is an ancient Canaanite deity that demanded child sacrifice, and so does it make anyone surprised that the very first thing they did in this war was kill a bunch of children? Well, it should not. And in case you think this is some stupid conspiracy theory, the Epstein files themselves talk about Baal multiple times, and that was even the name of Jeffrey Epstein's bank. So before you come at me and say, oh, well, Trump is a Christian, or, Israel follows Judaism or whatever, no, they don't. And I think this footage from right before the war might explain a little more than we think about why this war really broke out.
The sad thing is, in this whole story, they don't realize that the world is getting ready for this thing they're burning to come and rule over all of them. And again, they're tying this to Israel and America specifically.
And that is completely correct, because that is who Israel and the United States ultimately serve. A God that demands the death and the mutilation of children, something which Israel and the United States have shown us just months ago that they are completely willing to do and are complicit in. So before any of you guys come in and say, oh, well, these are the good guys because they want to liberate Iran or something. No, they don't. Again, does not mean that Iran is in any way a good country. But this war, even if you don't believe there's any connection to Baal, this war clearly already has no justification. And the real reason, which is, of course, regime change, among other things, was revealed at the very start.
Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in massive U.S. and Israeli strikes on Saturday. That's according to a social media post from U.S. President Donald Trump. He did not elaborate on the source of the information, but a senior Israeli official told Reuters Khamenei's body had been found. Netanyahu also said Khamenei's compound had been destroyed, and Revolutionary Guard commanders and senior nuclear officials had been killed.
They will never have a nuclear weapon.
In an early morning address, Trump said the strikes on Iran were aimed at ending a security threat, and he called on Iranian security forces to lay down their weapons and invited the Iranian people to topple their government once the bombing ended.
When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations.
Iran called the U.S.-Israeli strikes unprovoked and illegal.
So, of course, as many of you know, during the first day of the war, the Israelis and Americans were able to successfully eliminate Ali Khamenei. Now, unlike some other people who are against this war, I am in no way mourning for him. In fact, I am glad that that terrible tyrant is dead. But at the same time, as you can see from that footage, this hardly looks like liberation, and while with 30,000 protesters having just been massacred the month before, I think it kind of makes sense why nobody really was in the mood to rise up against the government. How did Iran respond to all this? Well, you see, Iran pretty much had no options. It had a population that hated it, it had a completely worthless currency, and basically an economy that was destroyed, and it had no international support. But what happens when you corner a threat that still has just enough power to fight back? Well, it usually goes full out, and that is exactly what Iran did, attacking nearly all of its neighbors, striking US bases and allied forces in Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and then unleashed its greatest weapon, closing the Strait of Hormuz, which, keep in mind, supplies a fifth of the world's oil, which immediately brought the global economy to a standstill. Now, obviously, this was not a positive development, but to give credit to Iran, it was the completely rational thing to do, especially because Israel and the United States had shown over and over and over again that they were not good faith actors and that they had no interest in peace or diplomacy. But you might be wondering, how did the United States and Israel respond to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz? Well, Israel soon showed its hand and demonstrated to the entire world what it was really after by taking advantage of the chaos and beginning an invasion of Lebanon 5 days later, starting the 2026 Lebanon war that is still ongoing as of the time of recording. Why Lebanon? Well, because in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the Islamist militia supported by Iran, has a lot of bases and support, and they regularly go to war with Israel, so Israel used the pretext of Hezbollah being in Lebanon to attack them. Meanwhile, how did the United States respond? Well, why don't we take a look?
Furious Donald Trump has unleashed a blistering threat to Iran, saying, "Open the f***ing strait, you crazy or you'll be living in hell."
Ah yes, a very moderate and presidential response to this threat. Oh, and also, why praise be to Allah? Is Trump a Muslim now? Well, actually, maybe by the end of the video it might make sense why. It's not that crazy of a theory. Just wait and see.
It comes after the US president yesterday warned the regime they had just 48 hours to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Reopening the vital shipping lane has become Trump's top priority since the IRGC started laying mines and firing missiles at oil tankers to block the 19-mile strait. Trump on Saturday gave Tehran a 48-hour ultimatum to unblock the passage and make a deal, telling the Islamic Republic's leaders that time is running out. But Iran hit back, saying they would turn the region into a hell and a swamp for US soldiers if the president escalated the war.
Inside that the Iranian nuclear sites have been totally obliterated. What's left to go after?
Well, you could get whatever the dust is down there. That's really the least of the mission. If we do it, that would be the least of the mission. But we'd probably grab whatever's left. It has been obliterated, as you know.
On March 8th, Iran announced that it had a new leader. The regime change was successful. Oh, wait, who was this?
As rescue crews pulled bodies from the rubble in Tehran, with more explosions thundering nearby, the Iranian regime planned a party, ordering a mass rally to celebrate their newly named supreme leader. A mural was unveiled showing former Ayatollah Ali Khamenei passing the baton, handing an Iranian flag to his son and successor, Mujtaba. Even a cardboard cutout was apparently brought on stage. But the man himself was missing. Khamenei has never given a single public interview or speech. But those who know him, including this Iranian regime defector, say he's even more extreme than his father. For Iranians who have fled across the border here to Iraq, hoping for regime change and a chance to return home, news of the new supreme leader isn't sitting well.
Oh, it was just Ali Khamenei's even more extreme son taking power. Great job. Great job, America.
Every bridge in Iran will be decimated by 12 o'clock tomorrow night, where every power plant in Iran will be out of business, burning, exploding, and never to be used again. I mean, complete demolition by 12 o'clock.
The president asked if that would amount to a war crime.
Are you concerned that your threat to bomb power plants and bridges amount to war crimes?
No, not at all. No.
Wouldn't that be punishing Iranians for the actions of the regime?
They would be willing to, and it's suffering. They would be willing to suffer that in order to have freedom.
The president has been threatening to attack Iran's critical infrastructure for weeks, repeatedly delaying his deadline amid ongoing negotiations with the country.
Are you winding this down?
Can't tell you.
Or are you escalating?
I can't tell you. I don't know. I can't tell you. Depends what they do.
While the United States was threatening to commit war crimes, Israel, of course, was actually the one doing them. And its strikes on fuel depots caused a river fire to pour out on the streets, causing Tehran to be engulfed in thick black smoke, which led to toxic acidic rain falling around the area. No, apparently it wasn't enough to just have the fuel depots destroyed or to have the entire city on fire. Nope, now they needed to just cause some acid rain just for the fun of it. Now, obviously, the war, as we very well know, started falling apart. And part of the reason why is because, as we very well know by now, Israel and the United States are not very reliable allies. What do I mean by this? Well, why don't we take a look?
The U.S. and Israel are believed to be attempting to reshape the situation in Iran by mobilizing Kurdish forces, raising tensions as Tehran issues warnings to separatist groups. Our Cho Young-un starts us off.
Iran said it has launched strikes on Kurdish groups based in Iraq, accusing them of opposing the revolution and warning them against taking action as regional tensions escalate. State media reported that Iran's intelligence ministry targeted what it called posts of separatist groups planning to infiltrate the country through its western borders. The move comes amid reports that Washington is considering arming Kurdish groups to join the fight against Iran. Kurdish officials told the Associated Press that the United States has asked Kurdish forces to support such efforts and confirmed that they have been in contact with the U.S. authorities regarding a potential ground operation. Meanwhile, the White House said reports that President Trump had agreed to any plan to arm Iranian Kurdish forces are completely false.
What's going on here? Well, to make a long story short, essentially what happened is that Israel and the United States were planning on arming separatists in Iran that would work with them to overthrow the government. Now, this was the only realistic option that the United States and Israel had, and that is because, of course, a ground invasion would not have worked. Israel did not have the logistics or the manpower to pull something like that off, and the United States, even if it had all the support it needed, would have still had a very hard time taking over a mountainous country of 90 million people, much less when they had almost no support for the war, because most Americans rightfully understand that they have no stake in this conflict and that this was a completely avoidable foreign war caused by the usual suspects. But if they could get the Iranians themselves to overthrow the government, perhaps not through a protest because they are not armed, but through actual armed groups, then they might have a chance. So you might think, okay, well, why didn't this work? Well, quite simple, because the United States is simply an unreliable ally. See, the United States had made the same promise to the Kurdish separatists fighting in Syria for their independence, but they abandoned them the moment that they were no longer needed. And so, without any guarantees or protections, the Kurds were unwilling to fight against Iran and potentially get slaughtered, which meant that the United States and Israel blew their only real chance at winning the war. And how do we know this? Well, why don't we look at how the rhetoric changed after this?
I am demanding that these countries come in and protect their own territory, because it is their territory. It's a place from which they get their energy, and they should come and they should help us protect it. You could make the case that maybe we shouldn't even be there at all, because we don't need it. We have a lot of oil. We have the
So, according to this clown, European and I guess broadly American allies should get involved in the war because this war directly affects their energy prices.
Gas prices in Europe are climbing fast after US and Israeli strikes on Iran unsettled global energy markets and revived fears of a wider supply shock. On Tuesday, Europe's benchmark gas contract, the title transfer facility, surged above €60 per megawatt hour, a sharp jump from the low 30s at the end of last week. Analysts say traders are pricing in the risk of disrupted LNG flows, particularly shipments from Qatar that pass through the strategic Strait of Hormuz.
But wait a second, wouldn't none of the prices have been affected if the war hadn't started in the first place? Especially because if you think the war is unpopular in America, man, in the rest of the American influence world, it is completely opposed. And no one wants this, especially because we all could predict that we would now face a global energy crisis because of this guy's failed and stupidly thought out war.
China, as an example, gets about 90% of its oil from the Hormuz Strait. And nice to have other countries police that with us. And we'll help. We'll work militarily. As far as I'm concerned, we've essentially defeated Iran.
Now, the idea that China would risk its own people to open a strait that was opened before an American-caused war is quite ridiculous. But luckily, the Europeans, in a rare display of actually having a spine, chose not to help the United States in their useless and pointless war. And so these very allies that Trump had recently called completely useless and a burden now decided not to get involved. And that lack of international cooperation and legitimacy, well, after a while, it started to show because the United States was getting more and more desperate.
And just so we set the record straight, because I've been watching the Wall Street Journal's fake news and all these stories that get printed like, oh, I want to make a deal. They are begging to make a deal, not me. They're begging to make a deal. And anybody that saw what was happening over there would understand why they want to make a deal. But they say, oh, we're not talking to them. Anybody would know that. And only a total fool. And they're not fools. They're very smart, actually, in a certain way. And they're great negotiators. And they are begging to work out a deal. I don't know if we'll be able to do that. I don't know if we're willing to do that. They should have done that 4 weeks ago. They should have done it 2 years ago. So we estimate it would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to achieve our mission. 26 days in, we're extremely, really a lot ahead of schedule. The Iranian regime is now admitting to itself that they have been decisively defeated. They're saying to people, this is a disaster. They know it. That's why they're talking to us. They wouldn't talk otherwise. But they're talking to us because they've got a disaster in their hands. They're defeated. They can't make a comeback. We're free to roam over their cities and towns and destroy all of their crazy nuclear weapons and missiles and drones that they're building. And we're doing that. They now have a chance to make a deal, but that's up to them.
Fittingly, on April Fool's Day, Trump had proclaimed that he had dramatically curtailed Iranian missile and drone systems. And so the war was basically over. After all, we just heard Trump say that the Iranians were begging for a negotiation. But then he promised to escalate attacks against Iran for the next few weeks, bomb them back to the Stone Ages where they belong, and somehow we're supposed to believe that he was there to liberate the people, to get justice for the protesters. Yeah. And if you still think that this war has anything to do with some just and moral cause against the evil regime, let's just remember this moment, when he literally threatened to annihilate Iranian civilization. That same day, Trump then agreed to a ceasefire with Iran, which would also include a cessation of Hezbollah's attacks against Israel. And so guess what? Both sides get what they want. But is Israel known for ever respecting ceasefires? Well, if Gaza is anything to go by, obviously not. And in fact, the very day after the ceasefire was signed, they killed 357 people and injured over 1,200 more. After this, Iran obviously agreed to no longer negotiate, and they once again closed the Strait of Hormuz, and that was the end. And so once again, we were back to square one. So what would the United States do now?
President Donald Trump ordered the U.S. military to blockade the Strait of Hormuz after marathon talks with Iran wrapped up on Sunday with no deal to end the war. In a social media post, Trump said he also told the Navy to, quote, seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran. It came after U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance announced the failed result in Pakistan's capital where the talks were held.
Therefore, on April 13th, Trump, ever known as the military genius, came up with an incredible new strategy. He would just blockade the blockade, because after all, that is how it works. Now, 3 days later, on the 16th, Israel and Lebanon agreed to a truce, and so Iran announced it would open up the strait. Let's go, the war's over, but wait, who's decided to still enforce the blockade? Of course, it's the United States. And so even though Iran wasn't blockading the strait, the US was, and so with no other choice, Iran once again was forced to close it. And so that was the state of the war for the final 2 months. For any of you who were following the war, you might have noticed there was a lot less news, and that is because there weren't really that many airstrikes, that many attacks on leaders, on vessels. Basically, you just had this stupid idea of blockading a blockade because they wanted to open the strait once the war was over, even though it was already open before. But guess what? The United States hadn't gambled that Iran would survive this long, and they soon got very, very tired of blockading the blockade. Therefore, 2 months later, and after 4 months of absolute stupidity, the United States decided to give up, and they negotiated a deal in which Iran agreed not to produce nuclear weapons, which they had already agreed to in 2015, in exchange for Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And then finally, on June 17th, Trump signed the Memorandum of Understanding in Versailles. An ironic twist because another empire surrendered its own disastrous war there 107 years earlier. And let's just say things did not end very well. Now, of course, Trump, as usual, tried to say that it was a great American victory and that Iran had accepted unconditional surrender, even though he achieved none of his goals and had to pay $300 billion to Iran in reparations.
We killed all their leadership, and then they met to choose new leaders, and we killed all of them. And now we have a new group, and we can easily do that, but let's see how they turn out. We have really regime change. You know, this is a change in the regime because the leaders are all very different than the ones that we started off with that created all those problems. So this was, I think we can say, Jason, this is regime change, right?
Let's recap everything that happened. The United States attacked a country that had literally issued a religious prohibition on nuclear weapons, had agreed in 2015 not to use nuclear energy for military sources, then was backstabbed after the US left the deal 3 years later, and attacked the country unprovoked last year. Now, the United States sat and did nothing while the Iranian protesters had a serious chance to overthrow the regime, and waited until it was crushed before attacking due to an unprompted Israeli attack while in the middle of negotiations. While quickly killing the leadership as well as over 150 innocent school children, they failed to arm the separatists, establish a more hardline leadership in the regime, and tried to blockade a blockade, leading to surging energy prices, a destabilized economy, and a rift with American allies. Now they realize that they have no chance of winning, having just killed at least 8,000 people and injured 50,000 more, just so that they could get a disarmed state to promise not to get nukes, for a hardline tyrant to be replaced by his even more evil son, and for a strait that was already open to be opened once again. Truly a masterclass in warfare for the first Secretary of War in decades. Now, I will say that if you still support the Iran war after all this, you are probably genuinely too stupid to have a serious opinion, since it achieved nothing except deaths and had little chances of ever succeeding. And finally, let us not forget that this war was precipitated by the actions of a genocidal state that runs the United States government and a huge sex trafficking ring to obtain blackmail on politicians. And speaking of our greatest ally, what is going on with them now? Well, other than violating the ceasefire that was already agreed to, there are also many other disturbing facts coming out this week.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posted this on X. I spoke this evening with President Trump and told him that if Hezbollah does not stop firing at our cities and citizens, Israel will strike terrorist targets in Beirut. This position of ours remain unchanged, and the IDF will continue to operate as planned in southern Lebanon.
President Trump inserts a prayer in the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem today. He is the first sitting U.S. president to visit the holiest site in the Jewish faith.
We know that Trump is a complete and utterly bought-out puppet of Israel. But even he is getting fed up, as we heard recently.
That President Donald Trump has apparently lashed out at Benjamin Netanyahu in a phone call. This is what Axios is reporting, citing 2 US officials and a third source briefed on this phone call. So according to these reports, Donald Trump says, "You're effing crazy. You'd be in prison if it weren't for me. I'm saving your ass. Everybody hates you now. Everybody hates Israel because of this."
Hey, I get it. Yeah, Israel is undermining peace. But I mean, they can't be that bad. Oh wait, why don't we just look at what their current ministers are saying?
Israel's security minister, Itamar Ben Gvir, he posted this manic tweet today that's garnered over 11 million views now. Unsurprisingly, actually, of course, it's not posted in any American media. He went on X and he stated, "For every tear of an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mothers must weep. All of Lebanon must burn, all of it. With all due respect to the Americans, Israel must make it clear to the entire world that the blood of our sons and the security of our citizens are not forfeit. All of Lebanon must burn. Our supreme duty is to protect the citizens of Israel and the soldiers of the IDF, and this commitment takes precedence over every other consideration. I told the Israeli Prime Minister, even in our private meetings, for every tear of an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mothers must weep. Enough with the ping pong. In the Middle East, you don't win with measured responses and